Hello and welcome to Book of the Mouse Club, episode 55, Thursday, March 25th, 2021.
Morning, monsieur.
Where are you off to?
The bookshop. I just finished the most wonderful story about a beanstalk and an ogre and...
That's nice. Marie! The baguettes! Hurry up!
I'm sorry, but how can one possibly pay attention to a book with no pictures in it?
My dear child, there are a great many good books in this world without pictures.
I almost bounced clear out of the book. Some bouncing, huh?
Come home or make myself known.
J. Thaddeus Turtle, Esquire. Have you never met him? You will find his story in this delightful little book, The Wind and the Willows.
I've come to return the book I borrowed.
Finished already?
Oh, I couldn't put it down. Have you got anything new?
Welcome back. I'm your host, Courtney, and I am joined, as always, by the Mary Blair to my Retta Scott, my lovely co-host, Emily.
Hey, Courtney. Hey, listeners. Courtney, that was such a nice compliment. You're making me blush. This was such a great book. I'm really excited for us to talk about all of these amazing women who worked at the Walt Disney Animation Studio.
Today, we're celebrating Women's History Month with a discussion on the Queens of Animation, the untold story of the women who transformed the world of Disney and made cinematic history by Nathalia Holt. Before we jump into that, we wanted to also highlight a woman-owned small business and continue our commitment to sharing cast members' independent creative creations. Joining us briefly today is Dorothy of Matchmaking Librarian. Welcome, Dorothy.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. This is my first podcast.
Well, welcome to the show. And I actually just placed a Matchmaking Librarian order last night, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what you select for me. To get us started and to get to know you, could you share with our listeners what Matchmaking Librarian is all about?
Sure. So Matchmaking Librarian is kind of bringing that mystery of, like, you're not quite sure what you're going to get from, like, a blind box or a blind date and getting you excited about a book you may have not heard of. You go on our website and you pick if you want a hardback or a paperback, and then you choose your favorite genre, or you can leave it completely up to me and surprise me. And then we'll pick a book for you based off that genre. If you're an avid reader, we say, hey, send us your Goodreads. That way we kind of know a little bit about you and we don't send you a duplicate. And then to make it even better, you get a homemade bookmark that I make out of fabric, and you get a little tea so you can kind of make your own little blind date at home.
I loved it. My boyfriend got me one for Valentine's Day, so then I shared it with Emily. I was like, we need to talk to her because I feel like this fits so perfectly. So I'd love to know what inspired you to create this small business.
So ironically enough, it was actually a spur of the whim kind of thing. One of my friends asked me for a book recommendation. I was like, yeah, I actually have it right here. And he was like, can I borrow it? And I was like, you can keep it. And he's like, well, let me give you money for it. I feel bad. And I was like, sure. So to make it like a cute package, especially because in quarantine, I feel like we're all just kind of deciding if we're getting a package that day or not. I put like a little tea and a little bookmark. And he was like, you need to sell this. Like, you read so much, because I read obsessively. He's like, you could sell these. And I asked my friends, and like that night, 4 of my friends were like, yes, let me Venmo you money. So I ran to Target before they closed to get like envelopes and like fabric to make bookmarks, and it just kind of kept growing from there.
That's so cool, especially how you can take something you're passionate about and just love to do, and now you have a business, you have followers, you have people that are supporting you. That's such a great start.
Yeah, I mean, it's been so funny because when people started blowing it up on TikTok, which I'm super grateful for, I called in my mom for help. I was like, I can't make 200 bookmarks in a week, but I need like 200 bookmarks. So we had an assembly line where I was cutting the like shape of the bookmarks and she was sewing them, and my dad was flipping them around.
Aww.
It was amazing, but it was just so funny because I was like, I have like 200 bookmarks too, and like, at first it was just me, you know, and it was like 3 bookmarks a week, but now I'm like, okay, I need to pull in my mom and my dad for a while just to help me, and they've been so supportive about it. They're still not quite sure what's happening. They just know they have to make bookmarks once in a while.
That's awesome. And we can tell from your page and also from your website and the fabrics that you select that you are also a Disney fan.
I am. Been growing up that way thanks to my mom.
So as an avid reader and a Disney fan, we want to know, do you have a favorite Disney book?
So one of my favorites is Once Upon a Dream by Liz Braswell. It's one of the Twisted Tales. There's a lot of them, but this one was the one that kind of shook the story up the most to me, and it almost deals with a little bit of like depression with it not being so head on in your face, which was super surprising for a Disney book. So I highly recommend it.
Very cool. We did a Liz Baswell Twisted Tale. I think it was Liz. It was Part of Your World, the Ursula one, which was a lot of fun, though. They're definitely on our radar for others, so we appreciate the recommendation.
Yeah, Once Upon a Dream is one of my favorite, and then I think they're making a Hercules one very soon. I'm not sure who the author is on that one, but I'm really excited to see that.
Very fun. Well, what is the best way for our listeners to place an order, and where can they keep up with you on social media?
Yeah, so matchmakinglibrarian.com is going to be the website where they can make orders. There's also a contact form if they want to reach out with their Goodreads or just any questions before they purchase. I check it once every 2 days at least. And then Matchmaking Librarian also is on TikTok and on Instagram, just on the same name. If they have any questions that are bigger or they're looking to do wholesale for bookmarks, they can go and reach me on email with matchmakinglibrarian@gmail.com. Made it very easy.
Thank you so much for sharing that for our listeners, and I'm sure I'll be placing another order soon. I know Emily's excited to get hers.
I can't wait.
Well, I am so glad that we get to celebrate Women's History Month by highlighting a small business, and let's keep our celebration going with our discussion today. Emily, could you provide a little background on the Queens of Animation and its author?
Sure. So this was published in October of 2019, and the author is Nathalia Holt. She is a New York Times bestselling author of Queens of Animation, The Untold Story of the Women Who Transformed the World of Disney and Made Cinematic History, very long title, Rise of the Rocket Girls, the Women Who Propelled Us from Missiles to the Moon to Mars, and Cured, the People Who Defeated HIV. Her work has appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times, the LA Times, the Atlantic, Slate, Popular Science, and Time. She is a former fellow at the Ragan Institute of MGH, MIT, and Harvard University, and she lives with her family in Pacific Grove, California. So she has a whole history. All of the books that she's written have been centered on women who have made dramatic differences in their field. So this is what she is used to writing. And what's interesting is in her preface, and also I listened to Dan Heaton's from the Tomorrow Society podcast. He interviewed Nathalia Holt, and she said, Disney's not something she was ever super passionate about like we are, but from her preface, learning her daughters loved Cinderella. And she got interested in, well, who made Cinderella? And looking through those credits or lack thereof, discovered that there are people missing. And as she has, when she started doing a little bit of research here and there on the Walt Disney Company, she saw a couple names pop up, but not very many. And she kept digging deeper until she found some untold stories. And this just falls in the vein of the writing she's done before, talking about women in STEM, talking about women in the medical field. So this was just another great story for her to tell about unseen women.
Yeah, I was excited to get her perspective more as, I don't want to use the term outsider, but I guess as a non-Disney fan, to approach it more in an unofficial capacity and as more of an objective observer.
Yeah, I found that interesting also. And I was going to lean into that as we started our discussion, but I think that let her have a little bit more of a critical eye, the Walt Disney Company and how they treated women, because there were times reading this where I felt a little uncomfortable, which is good to expose ourselves to situations that challenge our perspectives and our biases. But I felt a little uncomfortable, and I think it was because I'm like, oh, I love this company so much that sometimes I find it hard to be critical.
Yeah.
And it was refreshing, and it did force me to challenge myself and my biases. So before we get started, let's ground ourselves a little bit in a synopsis of the book. And this is from the inside of the dust jacket. It says, from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs to Moana, from Pinocchio to Frozen, the animated films of Walt Disney Studios have moved and entertained millions. But few fans know that behind these groundbreaking features was an incredibly influential group of women who fought for respect in an often ruthless male-dominated industry and who have stayed under the radar for decades. In The Queens of Animation, best-selling author Nathalia Holt tells their dramatic stories for the first time, showing how these women infiltrated the boys' club of Disney's story and animation departments used early technologies to create the rich artwork and unforgettable narratives that have become part of the American canon. As the influence of Walt Disney Studios grew, and while battling sexism, domestic abuse, and workplace intimidation, they also fought to transform the way female characters are depicted for young audiences. With gripping storytelling and based on extensive interviews and exclusive access to archival and personal documents, The Queens of Animation reveals the vital contributions these women made to Disney's golden age and their continued impact on animated filmmaking, culminating in the record-shattering Frozen, Disney's first female-directed full-length feature film.
Thanks. I love that it goes from Snow White to Frozen.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting and a good way to bring about why I think when we talk about these women, maybe because you and I have done some prior research, we've read Ink and Paint, that when it said this is the first time their stories are being told, I'm like, well, sort of. Some of them I've heard, some I haven't heard before. I will say that. Or some things like about Mary and Retta Scott, maybe they weren't as in depth. But what was interesting is here, we often kind of isolate those women in their decades, kind of like the 1960s and before. And I liked how she made the connection to how without these women in Disney's golden age, Frozen may not have happened. So I do like that connection. And we're going to dive more into that. You and I have lots of thoughts. But before you started reading, I want to know first, what were your expectations?
So I was a little confused when this book came out at first. I'm not sure I've shared with you how it came across my radar. We had done the Ink and Paint episode for Women's History Month 2 years ago in 2019. So not last March, there was enough going on last March. The March before that, we did that. And then I want to say maybe in June or so, I was browsing on Goodreads, and you can enter giveaways for Kindle copies of books, print copies of books. I've never won one, but I've entered plenty. And Queens of Animation showed up. And I'm like, wait, what is this? Didn't I just read this book? And clicked in for more information. I was like, okay, it's not an official Disney book. Ink and Paint focuses a lot on Ink and Paint, and this has a little bit of a different focus. So it was on my radar. I put it on my want to reads. I entered to win. It didn't win. And then you said it came out that October. So it's been on our radar for a while, but I didn't quite know what to expect. Like, how much would we be getting that we already got in Ink and Paint? What new stories would be told? I feel like I had a good idea of the subject matter because, like you, I had listened to Dan's podcast as it came out because we're subscribers, and I believe that was maybe February of last year that came out. I remember enjoying that. I was like, oh, this gets into some stuff that I wasn't expecting. So I think I had a good idea of what it would be.
For me, it was similar. I came across it, I believe, for the first time in Barnes and Noble, and I saw it on, you know how they have those cases like in the front that's like new fiction, new nonfiction.
Yeah.
I saw it there. And because, as soon as I see something relatively Disney, I saw animation. I was like, ooh, what's that? And I was intrigued. But it did remind me a lot of Ink and Paint. But I was also intrigued that it was a smaller book than Ink and Paint. We're going to talk a lot about our comparisons of this book to Ink and Paint today. But I was curious. And I think didn't I give you the book for Christmas?
You did.
So yeah, you're right. It's been on our radar. But after doing Ink and Paint, I don't think we were so enthusiastic to get to it right away.
Right. We wanted to spread it out.
We even planned to do this one last year for last March. And then we were able to get an interview with Margaret Carey instead. So
we pivoted.
It got pushed.
We'll just do it next year. we plan ahead here.
So
kind of have to.
I'm glad we read it though.
Yeah, what was your overall impression of it now that you have read it?
For me, overall, I really like the book. I have some critical elements, which I know you do as well. But overall, I thought it was very emotional. We're going to talk about, I'll say that's my first comparison to Ink and Paint, is that I felt a lot more emotion coming from this book. I think it's also something that even if you aren't familiar with, or you're not a huge Disney fan or history buff like you and I are, that you can find something to relate to in this book, particularly as a woman in America, as a woman in a workplace. I think it speaks to a lot of women. We have characters that are single mothers who are working. We have characters who are dealing with abuse and domestic violence at home. We have characters who are dealing with pranks and harassment in the workplace. Like, there's just something for everyone to kind of for every woman anyway to understand. And I think it gives you that a new entry point into learning about Disney, which I thought was interesting.
I find it interesting that you called them characters, and this isn't a criticism, but I think it's a more direct result of the way that Nathalia writes this, because they are real women, but it's written in a very novelistic style.
Yeah, it was very easy to read.
I did savor this one and read it slowly. I am a bit of a speed reader, I think, as a casualty of being an English major in college, but I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna do like 3 chapters a day of this, like take it slowly, just read it before bed or on a lunchtime break, and really just took my time with it and enjoyed it that way. So I don't want to call it a slow read because of the subject matter, but like there was so much happening that I wanted to fully pace myself and enjoy all of it. So that's not in a critical way.
And I think because she wrote in, you said, a novelistic way, it's more of a narrative than, I feel like I'm going to keep referencing Ink and Paint.
I think it's only
felt
natural.
Almost more like a reference book.
Because it was so big, too.
Well, it was so big, but I feel like Ink and Paint was very
methodical,
logic and data driven. Like, here's where women were, here are the processes and the places they worked, here's what the workplace looked like. It gave a lot of information, and I feel like the way this is written, that narrative allowed for more of that emotion.
Yes. By one-ish criticism that I think you saw on my Goodreads, and I gave it 4 stars. I liked it. I just wish we got to hear from the women themselves more. And I mean that in that Nathalia had access, as you shared, to these women's letters, possibly journals. It wasn't quite clear to me in her notes section, because there is an extensive notes section, but there's not direct footnotes, so it's hard to go between the text itself and the subsequent notes. They're kind of just organized by chapter, but not tied directly. You can't just be like, oh, what does that footnote lead to, because there are no footnotes. So she kind of tells these stories, and it's like, oh, she thought blah blah blah, and yes, it reads well in a novel way, but I'm like, but okay, but where did that come from? I don't know. In a nonfiction book, I would love to have seen more direct quotes, because I feel like Brian J. Jones did that in the Jim Henson. We talked to him and he had access to his journal, but he always made it clear, like, oh, and Jim wrote this in his journal saying how he felt about XYZ. I just would have had to have more direct quotes, because I feel like she did a great job of telling these women's stories, but I wish they had a stronger voice. Does that make sense?
Yes, hearing more of their experiences from their own words versus an interpretation. What I did like was, this is kind of like a like and a criticism. I like that it was chronological. We had a very clear starting from the 1920s, going all the way into Frozen in 2010s. And what was good about that is that you saw the progression and the evolution of women in the workplace. However, the downside was all of the different women she focused on were woven with they were intertwined throughout everything. So sometimes I was like, oh, I wish we had just a Mary Blair section, just a Retta Scott section, just so that I could keep their contributions and who they were straight in my mind.
I agree.
Because you learned a little bit here, and then you wouldn't hear about them for a couple pages. Then you learned a little bit more about that same woman, and then you would jump to Mary, and then you would jump back to Sylvia.
Is the key word there, because I did feel that some of the transitions were abrupt. But I was glad that she brought it all back together in the epilogue, because one of the women, Grace Huntington, I was like, wait, but like, what happened to her? Which I get, her journey in the Disney narrative ended, and there were several chapters where we didn't hear anything, and it does shift to focus more on Mary and a little more of Retta, and then other women that are not at the forefront of this text as more generations come into the workplace. But I agree that it did feel like it jumped around a little bit. But overall, I'm glad that so many women did get a chance to have their stories told.
And I did like that she picked 5 to more particularly focus on, because again, like Ink and Paint, and we'll just lead into this. Let's start comparing.
Sure.
Like, what did we notice from this in Ink and Paint? But Ink and Paint, we had also many women mentioned, but we didn't get to have as in-depth of a story about them and we only saw them within the context of the workplace. Like Ink and Paint is pretty limited to this is what was happening in the company and was very focused on the Walt Disney Company and the studio, whereas we kind of get a more holistic view of Bianca, Grace, Retta, Sylvia, and Mary, because we also get to learn about what was happening outside of the company. What were the things they were bringing in, their experiences that they were bringing with them to work every day. And so I did like, even though there was some jumping, I did like that we got to focus on particularly 5 more in depth, because I think that really gave us an opportunity to develop that emotional connection with them that wants to have you pull through this story and continue all the way through.
Yeah, Queens of Animation, I would say, is a great complement to Ink and Paint, because Ink and Paint focuses mostly on that department. I do feel like, I know Mary Blair was mentioned in Ink and Paint, and I know Retta Scott was, and I feel like Bianca may have been mentioned. We kind of got these call outs within Ink and Paint. They're like, and these were women that did stuff outside of Ink and Paint, but they just got like a paragraph blurb, and these took those stories and fully fleshed them out. And I think the obvious contrast is that Ink and Paint is published by the Walt Disney Company, and this was not. So there's going to be some things possibly sanitized under one viewpoint versus another. So I think they're great to read in tandem. Ink and Paint is where the majority of women were, and I see Queens of Animation as these are the women who weren't in Ink and Paint, meaning the department, who had jobs outside of the primarily women's area and moved into men's spaces. So it's a nice, I feel like I like the order that we read them. Ink and Paint was a great, no pun intended, primer for this one to then go deeper into the history.
As usual, you and I have similar thoughts. I also saw this as the women she chose to focus on. It's clear she says Queens of Animation. She moves out of, you said, that isolated sphere where it was female dominated in Ink and Paint into let's see how women fared when they were in the rooms with men, not men who just happened to wander into women's spaces, but women going into men's spaces, which makes a big difference. And I think you do bring up a good point that Ink and Paint is published by Disney Editions. And I did notice that. I actually went back and listened to our Ink and Paint episode from 2 years ago today before coming on to record. And I did catch myself once or twice that I wondered if maybe my biases weren't challenged as much in Ink and Paint about how the Walt Disney Company treated women in the space. And I think it even came across in how maybe we, particularly from how I listened to myself, talk about it because of how they wrote about women. And like you said, there is a temperament there. They do have motivations to protect their image while also trying to be transparent at some level. And I think, and how we read something does influence what we think. And the same with this book. I felt like I was being more critical, and I think Nathalia was definitely more critical of Walt and the company than Mindy was in Ink and Paint.
And it makes sense that as someone from the outside, she has the ability to do that. So I do agree that it's nice to broaden our horizons beyond what we did 2 years ago. So let's go into kind of Nathalia's argument. In what ways did you see that women influenced the studio and its animated films?
Overall, a big theme I saw was when women were involved in story and in animation, those films were more successful. She makes a pretty clear point. Where I first saw this was in Fantasia. I think this came out very clearly in the segments of Fantasia, maybe not the success of Fantasia overall, but segments that women worked on, particularly the Nutcracker Suite, got so much praise from critics. It's what created, this was a story that shocked me, was the American fascination with the Nutcracker is thanks to these women. She brought the story from listening to the small tidbits of music she was able to get because she couldn't find a full orchestration recording of the Nutcracker. And then Sylvia created the beautiful fairies, and it came out of men didn't want to draw fairies yet. Fairies become a really big deal eventually in the Disney company, but they didn't want to draw that. So when women had these spaces, it became one of the most well-known segments of Fantasia and created this whole craze over the Nutcracker that we still have today.
That was really fun. I remember that coming up on Dan's show, so I kind of had that primer going into it, but then reading it a year later, I was like, oh yeah, I completely forgot that they had mentioned that, and it came right back to me. So I think that's a great example of their influence. I also feel like these women helped other women grow. Like there's that shared moment of being in the room and seeing the only other woman, and kind of like you do that little head nod like, hey, that they helped each other and grew and had these strong friendships within that studio system. Like I really enjoyed hearing about Retta and Mary's friendship.
Yeah, I did like Retta and Mary's friendship a lot. And also the most successful films like Cinderella had more female influence than those who did not. And we see that ebb and flow again into the 60s and 70s, where there's not a lot of women again in animation and story until they come back into the 90s and the Disney Renaissance. And there's more women in story, there's more women in animation, and we have The Little Mermaid, we have Beauty and the Beast, we have Frozen. And I think that was a trend she was trying to show throughout the book, that women in the room just brought a little bit more. It wouldn't necessarily be perfect, but it did progress films and create successful films.
Yeah, I think that's a great contrast to the opening, is Bianca running from the writer's room crying because Walt and other men have ripped up her storyboards. She's the only one there. There's no one to advocate for her or have her back and say, no, I think this is a good idea. And she runs out crying. But then by the time we get to Frozen, there's so many women in the writer's room. There's a whole sister summit to talk about sisterhood and the themes of sisterhood to bring into Frozen. And sisterhood in the literal sense, sisterhood in the metaphorical bond between women sense. So it was great to follow that journey.
Yeah, that was a big contrast. There was a point they said they didn't even let men in the room.
Women.
During the sister summit, they were like,
sorry,
come
I got
in the room.
I thought you meant the original.
And that is, like you said, such a contrast to before Bianca trying
I
to
went
come
to the
in
beginning first. Yes. Yeah. No men in the sister. Well, no, men were allowed in the sisterhood summit, but they weren't allowed to speak. They're like, you're here to listen.
Yeah, very, very big contrast. But that, I think, was some of the strengths in the book. And she was able to, I think, pull those points across that women had incredible influence. And we could see that when they were left out of spaces, maybe what could have some of these films that had a lot of problems, maybe they would still have had issues, but could they have been better? Could they have looked different? We see that women are valuable throughout this book. She makes that point very, very clear. Let's talk more about the women. Let's talk about these ladies. So she features 5 predominantly in the book. I'm trying to get to the page where she has. And I like that she gave us pictures of them in the beginning. This was something you said about Ink and Paint. The back of Ink and Paint has a yearbook set up, and you had said that you wished it was in the front so that you could kind of put a face to the name immediately. She does that. She has that.
I forgot I had said that. I'm glad you re-listened to the episode. Because, I remember at the Ink and Paint, I got to the end, I was like, wait, they were here all along. Like, a face to the name, literally. And she did put that up front, and I found myself flipping back to it, like when someone would be mentioned, like, oh, okay, that's her with her tongue sticking out in the funny picture. I did post them to her Instagram if listeners are interested in seeing them, the 5 that are the focus, which are Grace Huntington, Bianca Majoli, Retta Scott, Mary Blair, and Sylvia Holland. Now, these are not the only women mentioned in the book, but like you said, they're the core whose journeys were initially following, who set up the success for future generations. So what stood out to you about these women?
So I do want to start with Bianca because she is one of the first women into the Walt Disney Studios. She makes her connection by writing to Walt to get a job. She went to high school with him, and they weren't close friends, but enough that he would recognize her name. Maybe she said, "Hey, remember me from this class?" And he invited her to come to the studio. And it's poor Bianca who really doesn't get the benefit and doesn't have the opportunity to rise up like Mary, Retta, and Sylvia do. I think she is the character in the book where we feel the most sympathy, and her story really stood out to me because hers and Grace were the names I definitely did not recognize. So I think I paid more attention to them, and it's Bianca who both opens and closes Nathalia's book, again with that scene of her running out of the story room, and then at the end she brings it back to Bianca and she says, like, imagine how it could have been different for her if she had the opportunity to be with these women who wrote Frozen, or that today's animators or story writers especially have to reflect back to Bianca. And I didn't realize how many stories she worked on that she adapted. She adapted Peter Pan was one that she started working on way earlier than it ever came in through the studio. And it is kind of sad that a lot of the stories she started taking notes on and creating storyboards for, they start using them after she's gone. And the way she leaves the company is so sad, that she took a vacation, had never taken vacation before. She did, from what I read, it sounded like she did everything she was supposed to. I'm taking this week. I will be back on this day. And when she came back, her desk was cleared out and they said, "Oh, you didn't hear? You were fired."
I know.
And someone else was already working at her desk. I was like,
sorry,
oh my
what?
gosh.
Yeah, that's why you have HR now. Because what? And she made it sound so sad because she was like, her old high school classmate Walt didn't even say goodbye. And I was like, oh man, Bianca.
Or maybe didn't even notice that.
Yeah, because
she was fired.
The company's so big at that point. It's grown so much. So that was pretty sad.
But I did like how Nathalia didn't let us forget her, that even though she leaves the company,
she's referenced.
She is referenced throughout. Every time a new film came up that she had worked on, Nathalia references back to
she's
Bianca's
gone by
work.
Peter Pan, but she's like, and remember, Bianca worked on this. Another one that left kind of early was Grace Huntington, but I loved her subplot about aviation and her love of flying planes. I feel bad that she never got to fully shatter that glass ceiling. She did set aviation records, but she just really wanted to be a female pilot and wasn't quite given that chance, no matter how hard she wrote to these companies to be part of that. So she leaves Disney Animation because she gets a job offer from something more aligned with her aviation interests, but then World War II hits and like, oh no, sorry, we can't use you, which I felt was not fair because a lot of women were entering the workforce at that point. But by the time women start being needed for aeronautical things, she had gotten sick and was too frail to be able to do it. Another sad story.
I felt like Grace, though, was a little bit of a juxtaposition from Bianca. I think Bianca, while she was a pioneer in the fact that she's in the company, she is, maybe because of the intimidating space of being in a predominantly male workforce, Bianca was a little more reserved. I think she was a little bit more like what would have stereotypically been the criticisms of females in a workplace, because I think the mail really brought that out. Like, they made her cry. I think in some ways it was like, were you trying to prove a stereotype that is wrong for poor Bianca? But Grace was more rambunctious. She was more willing to stand up for herself and others in the room. And
they're nice foils in that regard.
Yeah. I feel like Bianca wasn't quite there, or her person, that's just who she was. She enjoyed working independently and having time to reflect and develop her work before presenting it. And Grace was more of a person who could jump into the deep end without much preparation and still feel confident in herself. And neither are wrong. It was just interesting to see how they adapted to being thrown in, because Grace came in after Bianca, and they did have that moment, like you said, that head nod of like, oh, there's someone else here. Did we just become friends? Yes. But how they both handled coming into the space, I thought was interesting to see. And I think reminds us that, the female experience of being in a workplace is just as individualized and diverse as any person in a workspace. All right, let's talk about Retta.
Yeah, this name I had recognized. I feel like she was mentioned in Bob Thomas's book briefly, but she was definitely mentioned in Ink and Paint, like had a feature of like, and the woman who got beyond ink and paint. And Retta Scott was the first female, like, full animator. She did amazing drawings for Bambi. She's featured on the cover of our edition of the book. I think the paperback might have Mary Blair on the cover, but for the hardback, it is Retta at her desk sketching Bambi.
Yeah, and the whole idea of the dogs, that's the story she's most famous for, is she drew the very, action-packed dog scene in Bambi, and that's what got Walt's attention and said, put her in the animator room. She's going to be an animator. And even the other animators remarked, like, they couldn't touch her when it came to drawing that scene. But unfortunately, that meant she was working on her own, and she was producing more work with less help than anyone else. But I did like also seeing other things about Retta. Another reference to an episode that we've done was Little Golden Books.
Yes!
She does leave the company, but she keeps a connection through a third party, through Golden Books, illustrating a lot of the Disney characters in their Golden Book format. And that's how she gets to work really closely with Mary, because she would get to see the concept art, because they'd be developing the Golden Book prior to the film's release, or in time, for the film release. So she got to work a lot with the concept artists to get a feel for how she should be illustrating these books. And that's how she develops a really close relationship with Mary Blair, which I thought was great.
Yeah, I loved like the photo of them in the middle. There is a nice glossy photo section. It's like them when they're much older, and like they're just still good friends. They lived together while Mary's husband was deployed. Retta moves in with Mary, and they're roommates, and they drink their martinis as the sun sets over California. And I was like, oh man, friendship goals, living the life, living the dream.
I really enjoyed her stories. And it is kind of sad though. She rises to animator, but then ends up having to leave the company. So she makes it to like that finish line, but staying there and maintaining was still a challenge.
We also have Sylvia Holland, and she is our single mother of the bunch. So I feel like that was a really important perspective to have, because Bianca and Grace, and even Retta to a point, are like young women entering the studio. Like they're the single gals early in their career, but Sylvia has a family. She has children who depend on her. She's a widow, but she's trying to make ends meet for her kids while working at the studio. So I think that was a great perspective to have.
So another story I really liked about Sylvia was she's the one who drew the storyboards depicting the Nutcracker Suite. She imagined the fairies. So there's this scene where both Balanchine and Stravinsky were in the studio looking over their different pieces that were being adapted for Fantasia. Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. Balanchine was there overseeing how his ballet was being reinterpreted for Fantasia. And Stravinsky was not very happy with what the animators came up with. But opposite, Balanchine was like, this is beautiful. I love this. This is amazing. And again, we have that juxtaposition of the Nutcracker Suite predominantly dominated by females, and Stravinsky's was a lot of the male animators. So this was a win in the female column that Balanchine really liked how his work was being interpreted.
Take that, 9 old men.
Did we have like 9 old men at this point? Like, were they really thought of, that solidified? Okay.
Yeah, they were there.
That's lost.
That
like,
was
at
what
point are they coined the 9 old men?
Well, in the book, I loved that Nathalia didn't even mention the 9 old men. As far as I noticed, it was like page 190. I was like, oh, there they are. Maybe it was 90. It was definitely longer in the book than I'd expect it to be mentioned, like that official term. And, that's what the Supreme Court was referred to. So Walt jokingly referred to his animators, even though they weren't old, as his 9 old men, these core animators, as a juxtaposition to these women, like, weren't even brought into the picture. So it was nice to just kind of like learn about them on their own at first.
It is a story about women, and they are at the forefront of the book.
That.
And then we have to talk about one of ours and many's personal favorites, Mary.
Yeah, do you want to go through the question from the group reading questions?
Sure.
I have
to
say,
really cool.
Emily always does a great job coming up with our discussion questions. They are usually all her, unless I'm like, hey, I want to talk about this one thing. But this time we are pulling, I think, 2 discussion questions from the book because they were good questions. So go right ahead.
I really liked, so Nathalia Holt has a website, nathaliaholt.com, and I liked that this book, and I think I want to say it was Rocket Girls, have reading guides, which I thought was really cool. I like when books come with discussion questions, and even if I'm not discussing the book, I like reading them and thinking about it myself.
That's why we have this podcast. So it all makes sense now.
But Mary is definitely someone who gets a lot of attention, and I think it's for a good reason. It's someone who a lot of people are familiar with, even if they aren't big Disney fans like that. And she is kind of the female artist name that's like the first one you think of in association with Disney. But she gets a lot of page space, I think also because a lot of people are also uninformed about Mary's story. So this is the discussion question that came from her reading guide. As one of Walt Disney's favorite artists, Mary Blair enjoyed remarkable autonomy and creative license as a concept artist on numerous animated features, but she also drew the jealousy of some of her colleagues. Do you think she would have been viewed or treated differently by these colleagues if she were a man? How did the resentment of coworkers ultimately impact Mary's career and legacy at Walt Disney Studios?
Okay, first of all, yes is the answer to do we think she would have been viewed or treated differently. And what really struck me here in this question was the mention of the word legacy, because then I think of this heartbreaking moment toward the end of the book. This book is very transparent in ways that I was not aware previously about Mary's relationship with her husband, Lee Blair, who was also an animator at Disney, but then left at the wartime, and kind of Mary stays on in this consulting capacity. But 1, he resents her for that in a way, and 2, it deals frankly with the subject of alcoholism and abuse, and the trouble within their family. But all that to say, the legacy piece, that was just so sad. This is where, okay, Nathalia didn't give us some direct quotes from women, but she gives a quote to Lee in the 1990s. After Mary has passed away, she is posthumously awarded the Disney Legend Award, and Nathalia quotes Lee as saying, well, what does it matter? She's like, why'd they give it to her? She's dead anyway. And I was like, that is just so sad, and like diminishes her legacy, which was so important. I mean, we still see it at the Contemporary today, the Grand Canyon Concourse mural. It's a small world, so much still standing in the parks, the concept art, Disney little golden books, and like we gushed about her on our 3rd episode of this show.
And Lee also makes the same comments that when he returns from war, he comes to the studio to like check in. He ultimately creates his own television production company and goes down that route because television is becoming this big new medium. But times that he did get to go with Mary back to work, or he came in to visit with Walt, he always made those snide comments of, oh, I could have done that. Yeah, it's good, but like I could have done that too. Like always devaluing the work that she put in. And there was a lot of jealousy you see throughout the book, those comments too. So Mary, I feel like, is kind of, she's what the other women in the book wanted, or what I think most women in a workplace aspire to. She was praised. She had autonomy to do what she wanted. She had resources at her disposal. But I think she's also a good picture to show that even when women are succeeding in a workplace, there are still obstacles and harassment and barriers that are those microaggressions that are still problematic. And what was great too was people like Retta and Sylvia, even though Mary had more than both of them, they never held that against her. These women were constantly holding each other up and being proud of each other's work.
The men were more critical, or after Walt's passing, Mary really doesn't get to do much with the company. Like, you know, she had committed to doing the Grand Canyon Concourse mural at the Contemporary, which occurs after Walt's passing, but she doesn't really get to go on to become all that involved in Imagineering as she had hoped before he passed, which I think is, as Nathalia speculates, because her male colleagues were jealous of her.
Yeah, and they even openly say that, and I don't think ever in front of Walt.
Right.
But she heard it, other people heard it, that they were like, oh, it's because Walt loves her. It's because she's a girl and Walt thinks, you know, she's just so great. She's another one of like Walt's daughter type.
Which women are always put against. It's like, no, she did this on her own merit, but people are going to make excuses or assume that women did something to get into their position. So these sexist tropes permeated all throughout.
And I think if
it's
she
a
were
tale
a man,
as old as time.
If she were a man, one, I don't think Lee would have ever been in the picture. Two, I don't think she would have left the company after the opening of Walt Disney World. She wouldn't have had problems finding other work to do. And I think she would have still had those connections, because it is rather unfortunate. Pretty much this kind of transitions into our next question about Walt. But once Walt passes away, at least from how Nathalia writes this book, we see a decrease, a drop of women in the studio, and we kind of go through like it's in accordance to the Disney Renaissance. We see a resurgence like 20 years later of more women coming back, at least into story and animating. This was something I did see different from Ink and Paint. Ink and Paint, because it went decade by decade, we saw women throughout, and we did see that there were women in the workplace in the 60s and 70s. But the way Nathalia writes about this, it seems like there's kind of more of a void in the 60s and 70s until the 80s. Right,
because Ink and Paint doesn't fully go away, but there are major layoffs, and I feel like she didn't touch on the people who stuck around.
Yeah, but we do see, I think, a way that as women were growing in the story and animation departments, even if they weren't lead animators, we had more in-betweeners or assistant animators. Once Walt passes away, we do see the presence of women in those spaces drop again after more layoffs. And also as the company, particularly animation, was going through their struggles as the company was shifting gears more towards live action and the theme parks. Their like next round of layoffs, we kept seeing less and less women. So really it's Walt that, for Mary, would we have even gotten her in the Walt Disney Company if not for Walt either?
Yeah, I feel like each book we read gives us a new perspective about Walt in the studio. You'd think like, oh, you're going to hear the same stories, but we get to hear from other perspectives. I think, we need to take some things with a grain of salt, whether it's an officially published thing or someone else's piece. But from Queens of Animation, what did you take away about Walt?
I think Nathalia, as we said before, was definitely more critical.
Mm-hmm.
But something that I reflected on and then kind of was confirmed with her interview with Dan on the Tomorrow Society podcast was she also saw an evolution.
Yes.
And again, not that Walt was perfect. He still, even as he was progressing forward, still had faults. Like more women were coming into the workspace and he was all about it, but he still had a men's exclusive club. Like he's getting there, but he doesn't quite still get it. But that was something I noticed about Walt was he is, I think she humanized in a way like he is a human being and he is subject to biases and he is subject to those faults like everyone else is, but you can also grow from them. And that's something all of us now are still grappling with in American history, but is also a very prevalent theme right now from 2020, 2021.
Yeah, I agree that it was good to, have someone removed from maybe the Disney publishing eye to be like, these are some of the stories that I heard regarding this, but nothing, I wouldn't say, oh, there was anything scandalous or shocking or surprising. It really didn't be like, oh, this person said Walt was blah, blah, blah. Like, it wasn't any of that, which I know there are books out there that try to make those claims. I think I like that you framed it around evolution. Like, yes, he ripped up these drawings of Bianca's in the beginning, but as Nathalia says in that interview, he then goes to making a speech right before the strike, I believe, saying like, women are entering our workforce and we value them and we're going to include them because they bring something to this animation that men don't, and recognizing their talents. Part of me wonders if that stems from him becoming a father to daughters, because
that's true. I think that plays a big piece as well. It's never been addressed, but I always speculated that.
Yeah,
too, that once he has daughters, he may have again. My speculation started to think of how would I want my Diane and Sharon treated, and that changes things. And that's it's all about developing relationships with people who are different than you. And you start to have that empathy and you start to find those similarities more than differences that now you can better connect and make those spaces. I was going to pull out some examples of that evolution a little bit.
Go right ahead.
So from page 19, like you said, like we see him immediately. The first scene of the book that we open with is that dramatic scene of him ripping up Bianca's work. But then when Grace comes in, he says, quote, I don't like to hire women in the story department, he began. In the first place, it takes years to train a good story man. That if the story man turns out to be a story girl, the chances are 10 to 1 that she will marry and leave the studio high and dry with all the money that had been spent on her training gone to waste, and there will be nothing to show for it. Then he continues on, he's like, I'm hiring you. This is, I hope this works out for the best. And he says, it's difficult for women to fit in this work. The men will resent you. They swear a lot. That is their relaxation. They have to relax in order to produce good gags, and you can't interfere with that relaxation. If you're easily shocked or hurt, it's going to be too bad. And we see like it's kind of that like passive compliment, like he's recognizing this is going to be hard, but he's also making excuses for why.
Right. It's kind of a microaggression. I feel like he thinks that he's doing the right thing. Like, oh, I'm just warning you. This is how it is here. But it's like, but does it need to be like that there?
Right. And then that's where we start to see, though, I have a couple more pages marked. Page 98. So then we have him really, that's where he sees Retta's work, his sketches for Bambi, and he then says the story department has now become the heart of the organization after he brings Retta in. Then we continue forward, page 127. That was the
speech.
What you mentioned, the speech about the strike. It starts with there's another. So this is quote from his speech. Another ugly rumor that we are trying to develop girls for animation to replace high-priced men. This is the silliest thing I ever heard of. He goes on to explain more, and he says, third, the girl artists have the right to expect the same chances for advancement as men, and I honestly believe that they may eventually contribute something to this business that men never would or could. So we continue to see, again, that development. And then the last one I had marked was 148. Oh, this is when, during World War II, I think this one also is a development of his perspectives on race.
Okay.
As well, not just women, but like we said, how it's kind of those conflictions of, in the time period, Walt and the Disney Company is seen as very progressive. They hire more women than everyone else, even though we do see that there's evidence that
they weren't paid as much. They weren't paid as much.
Gaps, the harassment.
But they were being hired.
Overall, I think we just see that Walt is complex. Like America in general. We can say and do one thing, but then say and do another, and have to grapple with how do we make our actions and our thoughts consistent. And we all are going to at times fall in our biases, but we have to learn how to check ourselves. And I think Walt was on that journey. I think if he maybe not had passed away from his illnesses as soon as he did, maybe we would continue to see him develop and challenge his own biases. And we start to see that in his workspace. And I'm curious what that would have looked like if he had more time, and as more women came in, how they could have helped challenge more. But then we do get a little bit of a dredge, but then they come back and we have the Disney Renaissance and Frozen, which we're going to talk about at the end.
Yeah, I think it was great to see more about Walt in that regard, and I like the way that you so excellently tracked that evolution. Thank you so much for bringing in those sticky notes. Another thing that we learned a lot about and have read in other books is the studio strike. It's certainly heavily focused on in Bob Thomas's biography, Walt Disney, an American Original. It's mentioned in Ink and Paint, but were there any new perspectives that Queens of Animation provided for you for this?
Again, I think it was the emotional piece. We had in Ink and Paint explain that there were women on both sides, but I think as we talked about, like, Sylvia, who was a working mother, I think we see the stakes a little bit higher in the strike for women. That yes, there were still women who went on strike, but we have that emotional connection now to Sylvia, to Retta, to Mary, who they need this job, even though they recognize that there are wrongdoings here. It's a space that I think a lot of women in history and even today get stuck in, is how do I work but also confront problems and discrimination, but that could threaten my job. And that's where we see, I believe it is Sylvia who, she sticks it out through the strike, but at the end of the strike, the negotiation they come to is there has to be an equal amount of jobs opened up to those who went on strike and those who did not. And even though she did not go on strike, she was one of the people that got cut. And so that was heartbreaking as well. And I feel like every time I read about the strike at the studio, I feel so conflicted because I understand both perspectives. Being a teacher, having a union myself, like that is a big piece of my job. So I understand the work of unions. I understand the need to confront discrimination and problems in the workspace. But yet at the same time, I feel for these people who, it is wartime. It is the end of a Great Depression. People need jobs. And
stability.
That stability. And I feel like we get more of that emotion in Queens of Animation, whereas Ink and Paint was more like, here are the facts, this is what happened, and then we moved on.
Yeah, I thought of Sylvia immediately as well, just knowing that she had a kid that she was responsible for. I feel like Nathalia did a great job of putting the emotional weight behind the decisions that people had to make in regards to the strike. Some of the women featured here did strike, some stayed, and we got to see the juxtaposition of that. She shares the story of two women roommates. One of them is striking and the other is still working, so like they drive to work together and the one gets out with the picket line and the other still goes to work, and how that created real tension between some of these relationships and friendships.
Yeah, and it kind of put the whole workspace, because we've talked about Ink and Paint and other times that we've discussed the strike, that while this book is focused on the women's perspective, anytime a strike is not easy for anyone. In my opinion, there's really no winners that come out of a strike. maybe you get some concessions that you were hoping for, but usually, there's that other side, the tensions that came from it, the exhaustion, the emotional toll that strikes, while necessary at times, there's not a clear victory. And we see that across the whole company. And while we get the women's perspective more from both of the books that we've read, the whole company kind of takes a back step. And unfortunately, that takes a lot of the hard work and progress that these women have made to fight for their space, their seat at the table in story and animation. It kind of goes backwards, and they have to refight for the spaces they were already in before. Alongside the strike, we also hear a lot about the warriors in Disney. They usually come in a package. You can't talk about one without the other.
Package films, package warriors, and strike.
So this is another question I took from the group reading guide from Nathalia Holt. It says, World War II marked a colossal shift for the entire country as women were asked to take over the jobs of millions of men who left to fight overseas. What impact did the warriors have on the women of Walt Disney Studios, and how did things change for women employees when the war ended?
Yeah, I think it is hard to separate from the strike since they were right around the same time. But for the warriors, Disney did see the impact of men going off to war, and women did get to step more prominently into the animation space. But unfortunately, I feel like with many industries, we learned that as men came back, women were kicked out of those roles, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, and that was something we had also talked about in Ink and Paint, so I think that was pretty consistent, which there could be strength in consistent stories from book to book. Similar that it did, women became animators, especially something we had talked about also in Ink and Paint, and I saw here was, while feature-length films is the passion that everyone wanted to work on, a benefit of the package films and doing these shorts and doing educational films for the government, it created more work, which created more demand, which, like you said, it brought women to story, to camera, to animation. And I think a turning point in World War II, just in general, of all women in workspaces, I think it finally, for a lot of women, they knew that there was discrimination, or they recognized that there were some hardships, but once they were like, now go back, that famous, we use this in high school history classes, go back to the kitchen, return to the homes. I think that's when it really clicked for more women that this isn't right. I'm just as talented. I'm put in just as much work. I should have the right to also have these jobs.
Absolutely. And I think that does start to lead into this second generation of women to the studio. Let's talk about them.
So I just want to throw out the names of some women. We kind of get a new list of predominant women in that last third of the books. We have Tina Price, Ellen Woodbury, Linda Wolverton, Brenda Chapman, and Jennifer Lee. And we see how all these women, they come into the same spaces. They are story writers. They're now directors. We have animators, women working on technology. That was something we had brought up in Ink and Paint, and that we see here with Tina Price, that women tended to be more hands-on with the new CAPS program and with technology, because as they were losing their jobs in Ink and Paint, they now needed people to take over. I saw this as kind of like Hidden Figures, how the women became really proficient in IBM, because that was just, they needed a new thing came in. It made the previous women's department obsolete. So now you have an excess of workers. So you put them on the new technology, but now they become the experts and you need them. So I really like that we emphasize women's role also in technology. So we get the STEM piece here as well as art. And I like that they called it Tina's department because they didn't know what else to call it. So I like that she had some power there, that like, this is her department. So that was cool.
I saw the second generation also as an embodiment of the second wave of feminism. You had mentioned the men's penthouse club. It was literally a club with membership dues at the top of the, I believe, animation building, where there were massages, food, and drinks, and women were not allowed to join. So once you get equality acts in the late 60s and early 70s, some of the animators bring it to now the National Organization of Women being like, okay, well, we want a club too, and we want access to this because that's equitable and that's fair. Unfortunately, instead of giving those women the ability to join the club, they just completely shut the club down, which makes things harder for those women because the men are like, well, you took away our club.
I'm like, that's not what we wanted. We just
no, exactly.
We wanted to share the toys, not take away the toys.
Frustrated for them.
It reminds me like children in a sandbox, like, well, if you can't have any, then, or if I can't have it, then you can't have it. It's like, that's not what they were going for. They wanted to share.
So I did feel like we got echoes of the second wave feminism and things that people like Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan were all fighting for.
What stuck out to me there, also being a government teacher, was also just how important legislation is for protecting civil liberties and civil rights. And this goes for all inequities that we face in the United States, that legislation does matter. It's not just changing perspectives, but also having the tools to reinforce it and to make it a national priority. Because while that was an example that kind of left kind of on a sour note and did show that there was tension, which I think was important to point out, that even as things progress, that doesn't mean tension goes away. I also like to think that, you know, those things helped more women get into those workspaces, having HR departments to help women, you know, report harassment, or having, you know, feeling secure that they can do well here. They have protection.
Yeah, as we wrap up here, I don't want people to think this is a depressing book, because it's not. It deals with just very real struggles that women have gone through, and I like Nathalia's transparency about it and not being afraid to dig into those. And like, we've talked about some of the very problematic things that these women face, but there are highlights, and I do think a lot of them come from the second and even third generations.
Yeah, I think you also echoed in Dan's interview with her. She even says that, I really hope people don't think it's all bad. There's lots of good. And we see where a lot of that good comes from when she makes that total 360 at the end of the book, where we have Frozen with the Sister Summit, the first female directed and Academy Award winning film. We have
Brave, even though Brenda Chapman doesn't fully get to have her fingerprints on it, she's instrumental in creating what the heart of that film is. Right. And I didn't realize, I knew Brenda Chapman from Brave, but her career goes back even to Beauty and the Beast and other stories of the Renaissance.
I was just going to bring up Linda Wilverton, who refused to let Belle bake a cake. I had no idea about that story. She was someone who said, well, if I were, you know, yelled at by the Beast after saving his life, I would yell back. So I loved her story, and I think we see a lot of parallels, like the spunkiness of Grace, the hard work and research from Bianca. We see the artistry from Retta and Sylvia and Mary, and they now have a space where all of them get the credit. They get in the credits, unlike a lot of these women did in the 30s and 40s. They win awards. They're recognized by name for those awards and have top grossing films. So I like how she ends that. It's very hopeful at the end.
Absolutely. It does tie up some of those strengths. Because as we were getting to the end, I was like, well, what happened to some of these ladies? And we do get to hear how some of them lived well into their 90s, and just thinking about all the change that someone like Bianca, who lived from, I believe, 1900 or 1901 up until 1997, everything that she got to witness, not only for the Disney company in that time frame, but just everything that encompasses the 20th century for her.
Yeah, so to wrap up, overall, any last thoughts, comments you want to leave about reading this book?
Yeah, I would recommend this overall. I think, you know, I was transparent about some of my criticisms, but that's not to say that this book isn't worth reading. I think these women's stories are worth telling. They're worth reading. They're worth sharing with others. So I'm glad that we finally got to tackle this one for Women's History Month.
Same. Overall, I very much enjoyed this. I'm glad it did end on that hopeful note and that empowering note of how women are connected through the Walt Disney Company from its inception in the 20s all the way to present day. And I also did appreciate having an outside Disney perspective that challenged me to think about Walt, to think about how animation and biases, it challenged me to think a little differently about subjects that I do often read about. So I was grateful for that challenge and for learning more about these amazing women.
Perfect. Well, what resources would you like to recommend for our listeners if they're interested in this topic?
So my resource I've referenced already like 7 times. I highly recommend Dan Heaton's interview with Nathalia Holt. That was episode 94 of the Tomorrow Society podcast, and we will have that linked in our show notes for you to check out.
Perfect. Yeah, I listened to it, because I subscribed over a year ago when it came out, and I re-listened to it this past weekend just to revisit. So I second that, but I would also recommend Walt and El Grupo on Disney Plus. I have not watched this yet, but I'm excited to. I believe it was recently added to Disney Plus. It kind of had a coming soon banner for a while, but that does detail Mary Blair is part of the group that goes to South America to ultimately create Saludos Amigos and the Three Caballeros. So it's a documentary about that trip. So I felt like that's a area that's not often explored, and I look forward to seeing more of Mary in that feature. Not related to Disney, but just if you want another similar read that's kind of told in a novel style about women who maybe haven't had their stories told throughout history, I would recommend the book The Radium Girls, The Dark Story of America's Shining Women. That's by, I believe it's pronounced Cyril Everard and Kate Moore. I was able to borrow it from the library last year. And it goes into the plight of women in the early 20th century who were painting radium dials and the effects that they later had, and kind of brought to light the effects of working with radium. Another kind of sad but empowering story overall. So I just felt it complemented this well in that overall theme. So if somebody liked this one, they might like that one too.
I believe it's also being made into, I think it's also a show on Netflix now.
Oh, cool. I'll have to check that out. I don't know if it's
Netflix or if it's HBO Max, but I'm pretty sure it's Netflix.
Too many streaming services to keep up with, but that does not surprise me. It would make a great documentary, so I will absolutely have to check that out. Next up, you don't have to wait very long, but we can't tell you much, but next Thursday we will have a surprise episode for you. We might drop some hints on our Instagram or Twitter, but stay tuned. I think you'll really enjoy an upcoming interview just a few days away.
Yes, the good news is you don't need to do any pre-reading. If anything, you may have already had a chance to read this book. So less homework on your end. If you're reading along with us with these, with our podcast episodes, you can just listen in and enjoy.
In the meantime, though, be sure to keep up with us for maybe some of those hints, teases, or at least the announcement when the episode's available on Instagram and Twitter at Book of the Mouse. You can email us with comments or questions or ideas, though don't ask us to spoil this for you, to bookofthemouseclub@gmail.com. Please be sure to leave us a review on iTunes so others can find our podcast and read and listen along with us. You can keep up with me, Courtney, on Instagram at GreatGuthsby or on Twitter at Courtney_Guth.
And you can keep up with me, Emily, on Instagram and Twitter at the same handle at Emily_McD.
Well, Emily, since it's just the two of us, will you do us the honor by closing out our episode with the quote tonight?
Absolutely. So I'm going to close our episode with the opening of Queens of Animation. So prior to the preface, Nathalia Holt has this quote from Adrienne Rich, and I think it's a good summary and of really just about the relationships between women. I'll read it now. The connections between and among women are the most feared, the most problematic, and the most potentially transforming force on the planet. And I think that is a wonderful theme and through line that we get throughout Queen of Animation.
Thanks so much for picking that one, Emily. I think it's a simple quote, but it carries a lot of weight. And I'm glad that we could discuss this text and celebrate Women's History Month appropriately.
Yes, this was a great journey. And I like that we had an opportunity to reflect on these women, but also on stories that we've read before and continue to expand our knowledge.
And we'll see y'all real soon. Of the Mouse Club has no affiliation with the Walt Disney Company. The views and opinions expressed by hosts and participants are theirs and theirs alone. They do not represent the organizations or companies they happen to work for.